So far, our main application uses Express.js as the middleware framework to fetch all of our diary entries from the backend. But in this video, we're going to expand our Express.js middleware by making it able to update and also delete entries with our backend service. So far, we've built our application with Angular and have partly covered the data service it uses to obtain diary entries to a backend server built with Node and Express.js. But in this video, we're going to flesh out the functionality of our Express middleware to enable full functionality of data from the backend. So currently, if we delete an entry and navigate away and back to the home page, our entry will reappear. And we're also unable to save any updated entries or to add any new entries. This is because the application only uses one GET request from the backend to pull all the data. So let's begin to update our Express server so we can add, update and delete all from that same array. So the diary data service adds entries by extracting the details from the form, creating a new diary entry and pushing it to the array. We're going to change this by making a post request to the backend server. So a HTTP post method is used to send data to a server to create a resource, and in our case that would be a diary entry. Therefore, we will need to append our new diary entry details to the HTTP request when it is sent. So we'll start by updating the Express app to read the incoming HTTP request. I will register a new middleware with the app. However, instead of using the method use, I will replace this with .post. So we can customize this method to specify the HTTP method it responds to. Therefore, I will also update the diary entries method from use to .get. And our post request will need to read the diary entry that is passed in the body, so we will require help from a Node Express package called body parser to do that. We can install body parser with npm install -- save body - parser. Next, we will need to import the body parser modules into a constant called body parser with the require keyword, and then we will use the body parser as an additional middleware by passing in bodyparser.json to support us in reading any JSON data from our requests. Okay, so back in our post method, I will give the URI as /add-entry, and I will optimize our request listener slightly by only passing in the request and response as parameters. I will not use the next keyword as it's not actually required in that method. I'll then push a new diary entry to the diary entries array by extracting the ID, the date, and the entry from the request body and creating a JSON object within curly braces. I'm just going to complete this post request by returning a 200 status with a JSON message of post submitted. And then back in the diary data service, I will submit a new HTTP post request where the expected response is a message of type string. I will also add a second argument after the URI to pass in the diary entry with the request, and this is going to be that JSON data that we extract on the back end. And just as we did with the GET request, we will subscribe to the response, and within that I will call the get diary entries method, and this is going to update the array we have on our static web page within the diary data service. Okay, so with our static website now making a HTTP request to our backend service, and our backend service now responding to that by accepting the request and updating the array, we can restart our backend service and test this. So if I add a new post with the date of the 29th of August and the entry of testing express and hit submit, we can now see it being reflected on the home page, and if I refresh the home page it will still be there. We would like to begin updating and deleting entries. However, to do this we need to identify each diary entry with their ID. So we're currently only using the index that it has within the array. So when we add posts, we would like to ensure that we're adding a unique number to the ID of that post. So I'll need to find the highest ID value that we currently have within our array, and then I will simply add 1 to it and give that to the new post. So back in the Express application, I'll add a new get method to return the maximum ID value. I'll create a new endpoint of max-id, and within this method I'll define a new variable. Let's just call this max. Then I'm going to loop over all the diary entries we have within our array, and I'm just going to change that max value to the ID of that entry if the entry ID is higher than what we currently have. So overall, this is going to return the highest ID value that we have within the array as a JSON response for the key of max ID. And then back in the diary data service, I'll need to update the ID for each diary entry before we send the post request to the backend server. So for this, I will create a new variable of max ID, and this will be a type number. Then within the onAdd diary entry method, I will make a HTTP GET request to the max ID. And then once we know what the maximum ID is, we can update the diary entry with that new ID, and we're just going to add 1 to it. And once we've updated the diary entry, we can make that post request. So if I just console log our diary entry after we've posted it, and I make a new post on our web page, in the console we can now see that is being updated as ID of 4. So our delete method currently works by sending the index of an entry and calling the splice method on the array of the diary data service. And we're going to change this so it passes the ID value of the entry instead. So in the diary component, I'll change I into diary.id, and this will later be passed to the node server to delete the entry of that ID. And then in the Express middleware, I'll create a new method with app.delete. The URI will be /remove entry, and I'll also add a / with the colon and the ID. So this ID will be used as a parameter within the method when we pick the entry to delete. I can locate the index for our diary entry within the diary entries array by using the findIndex method. This will loop over the elements in the array and will return a value where the element ID is equal to the ID from the parameter. We obtain the ID from the parameter through the request with request.params and then .id. So once we have the index of the entry to delete, we perform a splice on our array, and I will return a JSON message of entry deleted with a 200 success code. So back in the diary data service, I will update the onDeleteEntry method to send a HTTP delete request to the remove entry URI. I will add the ID after the /. We will subscribe to that response and call getDiaryEntries of the diary data service to update the latest entries in the array. So we're forming a bit of a pattern here when we make our requests to the backend server, and we subscribe to it and call getDiaryEntries. I will also update the expected JSON type with a message of type string, and I will also print that to the console. So the final part of our Express enhancement is to update the edit button. So to do this, I'll first update the diary component to pass in the diary ID rather than the index to the edit function. And the call to the edit function will navigate the page to the edit form. So then I will then update the getDiaryEntry method of the diary data service. So first what we're going to do is find the index of the diary entry with the correct ID, and then return that index back to the user. This will ensure we are pre-populating with the correct details as per the ID of the entry and not the index of that entry within the array. So when the form is submitted, the diary form component will usually assign a default value of 1 to the ID of the entry. This is updated when we call onAddDiaryEntry. But when we're in edit mode, I will reassign the ID as equal to the param ID that we have from the URL. As a result, the entry we're submitting will have the same diary ID to be updated, and therefore we're not just reassigning the diary ID whenever we update an entry. Lastly, to complete the update, I will create a new app.put method in the Express middleware. This will have the URI of update entry and will also take a parameter for the ID. In a similar way with the delete operation, I'll find the index by looping through the diary entries, and then I will reassign the diary entries array entry at that position with the new entry within curly braces. And back in the diary data service, I will update the update entry method to make a HTTP put request to the update entry endpoint, passing in the ID to the URI and the entry within the body of the request, just as we did with a post request. And in a similar way to our other HTTP calls, I will call the getDiaryEntries method to update the diary entries array in the Angular static web page. So that update process was a little bit complicated with quite a few different classes, so let's just walk through it one more time so we can understand how it's working from end to end. So we're sending the diary.id on the edit function, and then in the diary form that is going to be loaded, it's going to be in edit mode. So we extract the ID from the param map, we populate the diary form with the diary using the getDiaryEntry method. The getDiary method will return the diary entry from our array, and lastly, once we submit a new entry, we will ensure the diary ID does not change, and the put method from the node server will update our array in the backend. So that concludes this video, where we have successfully enhanced our application to manage the data in the backend Node Express server. Our diary data service makes HTTP requests for getting all the entries, updating and deleting them, and our Express.js server is responsible for managing the data completely. If I run through the application, we can see that we can now add new entries, delete entries, and also update entries as and when we require. So the final step of our main application is to persist the data from the node server with a MongoDB database. So I'll see you in the next video to do that.